Welcome to the Seeker's Table. I'm your host, Ian White-Marr, and each week I interview a spiritual companion to explore how contemplative practice can guide us into the sacred mutuality that binds us all together. This week is our final session in a 7-episode series on Lent, where we explore how we can use contemplative practices to open ourselves as we observe the journey through Lent with a particular eye towards justice. My guest is Dr. Kate Kamen. Kate is an assistant professor of practical theology at Methodist Theological School in Ohio and a Louisville Institute scholar. Her theological work focuses at the intersection of feminist theology, biblical studies, and reimagining the church, as well as integrating graphic design and design thinking into practical theology. Kate has led multiple contemplative groups exploring pilgrimage, meditation, and Lectio Divina. She also uses art as a spiritual healing practice to deal with grief and loss and reimagining new futures. I hope you enjoy this conversation. So, Kate, thanks for coming on the Seeker's Table. And just before, when we were getting ready for this conversation, we were having a little, just a prep talk about like what people were going through in this Lenten program. And for me, for my part anyway, what I was saying was that a lot of people were really encountering the humanness of Jesus as he's walking this journey, like walking towards the cross, and what he must have been thinking and what he must have been feeling. And then you told this amazing story about being in Israel in the Garden of Gethsemane. And I thought maybe we should just actually start there. What that was like to stand in the garden and see what you saw.
Yeah. Thanks, Ian. So happy to be here. So about 5 years ago, I was a teaching assistant on a Boston University trip to Israel, Palestine. And it was my first time visiting Israel and Palestine. And I didn't know what to expect, but I thought I was going to be overwhelmed by some of the, typical religious sites, like whether it was the Church of the Nativity or walking the path that Jesus walked through the old city of Jerusalem. And while those were powerful, I really had an unexpected experience that continues to shape the way that I think about Jesus and even my understanding of Christianity. And that happened while I was standing in the Garden of Gethsemane. So for folks who haven't been to Israel, let me just set the stage a little bit. The Garden of Gethsemane is in a valley. I think it's called the Valley of Kidron, but it sits right below Jerusalem. And the old city of Jerusalem is, some of the city walls are still preserved that would have been there when Jesus was alive. And so it's a really interesting place to visit. And so you could get these glimpses of what it might have been like. And standing in the Garden of Gethsemane, you're looking up over 500 feet at the old city of Jerusalem. And this particular gate in the Jerusalem wall was one of the more sort of majestic ones at the time. And it's where travelers that were coming in from out of state or wherever would wind their way up the mountain to get to Jerusalem. And you have this complete view of that pathway and of the city walls standing there. And honestly, it's like looking up at a very imposing sort of just fortress. And as I was standing there looking up, I was just sort of taken by the fact that this is where Jesus was the night he was arrested. And he had to know, it wasn't a mystery that he was really causing trouble with the religious leaders, but also with the Romans. And that the clock was running out, so to speak. And I just stood there thinking, wow, what a brave human. Like, if looking up and just seeing like the thought of the Romans coming out of that gate and marching down towards you, I would have been running for the hills, literally. And I thought the just the sheer courage, the sheer tenacity to stay there. And you can hear in the scripture, he's struggling. He's sweating blood. This is I mean, he's faced with his humanity and he's faced with empire. And somehow he managed to stay, even when his closest confidants couldn't even stay awake to be with him. And I just, in that moment, was just shook to my core, looking up and thinking, I would not have stayed. It just, and it made me realize that um, just the terror of of marginalized folks and of people taking a stand in justice movements, that this really epitomized that for me. And wasn't about Jesus being divine. It was about the full humanity of Jesus as a social justice activist, really.
Right. So the path that he was taking that had led him to that sort of, I mean, how symbolic, right? It like leads him to this edge of um yeah, just to this empire like structure. I mean, the metaphor of this great wall of and feeling so small, and yet and there, but it also for me, I guess, contextualizes, the people who have been with him, even though they were asleep, they get so easily, we sort of dismiss them, right? Like, oh, you guys fell asleep, but they were all there too, in the shadow of this great thing. I just, I don't know. It's such a, I I've never been there, so I don't know what it's like, but I do think that when we are able to put our own bodies in the place of these stories, it becomes so much more real in terms of what. I mean, I remember going to the Lorraine Motel in Memphis where Martin Luther King was killed, and I got to the balcony where he laid after he was assassinated, where he was murdered, and the thing that actually struck me was like it was so small, like the space that he must have fallen, and to me, like, I know he wasn't actually a big man, but like Martin Luther King is like 10 feet tall and 8 feet wide, and like arms, like, just because
Yeah.
he's such this outsized hero. And then when you get to see the place where I wept, like when you get to see the places where it happened.
Yeah. And the Garden of Gethsemane it's also filled with olive trees. And
Mm.
the legend is that several of the olive trees in the garden are over 2,000 years old. They're like carefully tended to and have been for thousands of years. And so you find out when you get there that very likely these are some of the same trees that witnessed Jesus being in that garden. And so it's such an embodied experience. And so you become connected to this narrative that's thousands of years old, but yet in a different way.
Now and I'm curious about how this journey like appeared for you in the ways of, where you thought something was going to be meaningful and maybe they weren't as meaningful as this one. Um, you were raised evangelical. And I don't know if this had been a trip you'd been looking forward to for a long time. But to finally go there and I mean, you must have walked where they, we're reading this final passage where they crucify him. Like you must have done all of those same those walks, or some of them anyway. And like, how has your religious journey sort of also, you know, changed and brought you to that moment of like actually walking in those same places?
Mm. Yeah, thanks, Ian. That's a really good question. So yeah, I did grow up evangelical. My mom was born again Christian, very evangelical. My dad was also born and raised Catholic. So we went to Catholic mass every Sunday, but then my mom would be teaching us sort of an evangelical version of Christianity. And we were always, Jesus in both of those sort of ecumenical settings was, yeah, this distant sort of God. Like I can still remember the crucifixion and seeing that in the Catholic Church. Just sort of this, the carnage of it wasn't represented. It was just this like peaceful Jesus on the cross. Um, and I just always had a deep love for God and felt very connected to spirituality and always wanted to talk about God. Um, and it wasn't until my high school years and coming to terms with my sexuality as being a gay woman, and as a queer person, neither of those faith traditions had an open and affirming theology. And so I spent about a decade really wrestling with, probably from the time I was 14 to 24, like really wrestling with how can I be gay and Christian, and feeling it was a deep, deep sin. And that sort of started my trajectory into theology. I just read as much theology as I could on at the time in the 90s when you're just going to the bookstore, like secretly going to like gay Christian, like, and there'd be like one or two books like Mel White, Stranger at the Gate. And I mean, that became my new canon. And
Oh my
so,
gosh.
and
I
I
mean, that's
was,
hilarious.
yeah.
There's so many teenagers were doing so many other things, and you're like, where are the gay Christian books?
I know. So it was, obviously I had theologian written all over me, but didn't
Or
realize it at the time.
priest? Yeah.
Yeah, or that. So I was finishing a degree in graphic design, and you know, long story short, ended up having some pretty traumatic experiences with faith communities, that I was involved with at the time, evangelical communities. And when I finally like sort of fully came out, being removed from leadership, and my partner at the time experiencing a very similar situation. In fact, she lost like all of her friends and ministerial companions, and so we were sort of thrust into this dark place. And at that point, I felt, I had a call on my life that I wanted to go into ministry and help to create a more affirming church for LGBTQ folks. And I was pretty committed to my path. We ended up in Boston, and as soon as I was working in a design firm, and started looking for seminaries. And I was very clear, like I'm going to become a pastor, and I'm going to do this work, this justice work, which is very much needed. But then sort of the unthinkable happened. A year after being in Boston, I got a phone call that no one should ever get, which was my mom saying that my dad, brother, and uncle had been tragically killed on vacation from a carbon monoxide accident. Um, and I was 26 at the time, working in the corporate world, had this dream to become a minister. And, it's just like the record, like everything just stopped. And that really changed the trajectory of my life. Now, not in the ways that people might think, like that's a horrible tragedy, obviously, and no one wants to go through that. But very early on, I was told by some spiritual mentors that there's no way around grief. You just have to go through it. And so that started, I basically entered into a 3-year period, sort of like an extended Lent, if you will. I knew that I wanted to go to seminary, that I had this vision of being a pastor, but I had enough sense to know unless I can really heal through this loss, um, or at least move through it in the healthiest way possible, then I'm not going to be able to minister to other folks. So I had a lot of support from my church at the time, a wonderful UCC church in Boston. Um, and I just entered into what I now call like a grief boot camp. I was numb for about a year and a half. When you have some sort of trauma like this, it can take a while for the feelings to come through, but they sort of all came out a year and a half later. And for 10 months, I just was sort of in the valley of the shadow of death. Like I was going to work, going to therapy twice a week, going to grief support groups, started to, basically I call myself an accidental meditator because I started getting intense panic attacks at the time, didn't know what was happening. my uncle introduced me to a 20-minute breath meditation and said, this is going to help with the anxiety. And I just did it every day religiously, not because I thought I was this great spiritual seeker. I just was like, I've got to do something to get my life, like the mooring was just, I just was so unmoored. So I just started meditating 20 minutes a day, every day, multiple times a day sometimes. And in this period of about 10 months, I realized spirituality, like sitting in that stillness, that there was a still small voice there, that there was not this promise that everything's going to be sunny all the time, but that this deep accompaniment that, like, I'm here too with you. I'm grieving too. My heart's broken for your dad and brother too. Um, and I didn't know that God. That wasn't the God, the triumphant authoritarian God of my youth. And by God, I made it through that time. And after about 10 months of that intense grief work, it really was like a springtime. Things started to emerge again for me, and I suddenly had the energy to do other things. And so I finally was able to enroll, get accepted and enroll into seminary, and started at Andover Newton in 2008, still thinking, even through this experience, that I'm going to be a pastor and for LGBTQ folks. And this is sort of, and this is to answer your question, how I got to Israel, basically. While I was doing my studies, this sort of ability to sit deeply for a long period of time and just be with the questions, be with the pain, be with stillness. When I got into graduate school, I started reading biblical texts that I'd read my whole life, and I started noticing some patterns in the text that seemed different. And I just, right then and there, after the first semester of graduate school, I just sort of paused and said, I want to explore this further. And I started doing a deep dive into these scriptural texts, and I haven't stopped since. And so along the way, it became clear that my path had changed, that I was introduced to feminist theology, and it was really to these other liberation theologies that were speaking to this God of accompaniment, this God that I had met in that dark place. And I just became more and more passionate about this deep theological research. And so that led me into a total career change into theological research and scholarship. And eventually, after I finished at Andover Newton, I ended up at Boston University in their practical theology program. And, my second or third year in, I found myself in the Garden of Gethsemane looking up. And I think, the Jesus that I felt in that garden was the raw Jesus that I met in those darkest days of grief and trauma. And it just, even now, just, it's like I can feel it. It's no joke to think you're going to take such a stand for your values that you would willingly put yourself into that type of traumatic experience. Certainly a deep, deep calling. And I don't think you get there if you don't have a deep, deep spiritual practice of stillness, of sitting with the hard stuff. And you see Jesus doing that all the time. He's with the crowds, but then he's going into the desert. He's always sneaking away from his disciples and getting these moments to process, to be in the stillness. And so I think that's how he gets to that garden, and how he can stay. And it's just powerful. I mean, and that Jesus, that wasn't the Jesus of my youth that I was introduced to.
Yeah, I mean the triumphant Jesus is almost like the Jesus on the other side of that wall, like the Jesus of empire, which is always just such a weird thing for me. But um, I I actually was not familiar with that term, the God of accompaniment, and I love that term.
Hmm. Yeah, I can't
you know?
quote any great theologians right now. It's kind of just, but it is there.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. Oh no, for sure. But I mean, I think that that's what so many of us, or I should speak for myself, but I think that that's what draws me to Jesus is not, I actually don't care about the miracles. I don't, none of that stuff really, I don't care about it that much. Like, it's not really that important to me as much as the, I understand what you're going through. Like, I know what suffering is, and I know how hard this is right now for you. Like, I've seen it. And I think that's the part of the Jesus story that is so, for me, so important. It's like to have uh, someone who's with me. Now, was there a different intimacy that came along? Like, how did that change from the Jesus of your youth? Was it just because of the sort of the forced meditation that, to get you through the grief, or like, do you do you even recognize the Jesus that you grew up with anymore? Or how does that is
um, I don't I don't recognize the Jesus that I grew up with as the Jesus that we encounter in the New Testament. Um,
Mhm.
I see the Jesus I grew up with in a lot of ways as the Jesus of empire, um,
Mhm.
and not the Jesus of the marginalized, not the
Mhm.
Jesus who was all about taking a stand against empire.
Mhm.
And I think that's the Jesus that we do meet in the Gospels in the New Testament. Um, yeah, so
So, I had this as we were getting ready, and I was getting ready for this course as well. Like, um, and in the passage that will go out with this video, there was this, in verse 40 and 41, to me there was this thing that like these two verses that just seemed to come out of, Jesus has been crucified, and he's dead. And then the next thing we see is, then there were also women looking on from a distance. Among them were Mary Magdalene and Mary, the mother of James the younger, and Joses and Salome. These used to follow him and provided for him when he was in Galilee. And there were many other women who had come up with him to Jerusalem. And for me, it was like such a curious two lines, because otherwise it just feels out of place. Like, if I were writing a story, like I would be like, well, these lines need to be edited out because they're not consistent with the paragraph before or the paragraph after. So you need to tighten up your language and like make your story better. And yet they're here, but they also stood out to me because, of course, the people who are in this course are overwhelmingly women, and any minister knows that the church is also mostly women. And yet we're really only now coming to having women leading the church. um I mean, in still many places they can't. It's so bizarre to me. I mean, as a Unitarian Universalist, I'm very much an outlier. Like, we had
yeah,
like
yeah,
Olympia Brown back in the last century. But
yeah.
even us, right? I think it really wasn't until the 70s or even the 80s where it started to tip. Um and But so here you are, you're a feminist theologian, a queer woman, raised evangelical, understands the dynamics of women really providing for the church, providing for Jesus, providing for all of this stuff. And when you read or you hear stuff like this, maybe you're just like, oh, yeah, yeah. That passage. But I just am curious where you are, like how a feminist theologian takes this death of Jesus and all who made his ministry. Like, what does that speak to you as a theologian?
Yeah, so another really good question. That when I talk about how my trajectory in ministry changed from seeing myself as a parish minister, wanting to becoming a feminist theologian, it is because I encountered not only women in the scriptures, but feminist interpretations of what it meant that there were women in the scriptures. Because I had grown up with these passages, I had read, you know, about these women. I never thought twice of them, but yet I grew up in a family with an uncle who was a pastor, an evangelical pastor, and said, absolutely not. Women cannot be leaders in the church. Like, it's scriptural. And so, you know, in my early 20s, when I was saying, I really want to work for LGBTQ justice and open and affirming churches, when I got to seminary and started encountering feminist theology, I learned, through feminist and queer theory, that all of this is interrelated. Like, patriarchal and misogynistic worldviews and theologies are completely interrelated. And I learned for the first time that actually it's a miracle that these women remain in the text. Like, how you said, oh, it sounds like, they're sort of copy and pasted in there, but actually it's kind of the opposite. Biblical scholars,
Yeah.
feminist biblical scholars tell us that, the Gospels went through, the New Testament went through a lot of redactions. And as the church over several centuries became more and more patriarchal before it became eventually part of the Roman Empire in 325, women were slowly being eradicated out of the text and the tradition. And that in reality, one of the ways that I see the good news of Jesus is that he did welcome women. He welcomed marginalized people all around him. He welcomed, everyone was invited into his discipleship. And the very fact that we still have strong women's stories in the canonical four gospels attests to the fact that the patriarchal church could not completely rid women from the Christian tradition, and it's not without trying. And so you have these really strong women, and you have women being the first witnesses to the resurrection, and the only people that stayed at Golgotha as Christ died. You have, and kind of the same thing, that the male disciples scatter, but then there are the women right there for him. And again, these are women, standing in the midst of empire. And I think, they had a lot more to gain from Jesus's ministry and a lot more to lose, because Jesus, invited them in a new way that they weren't perhaps invited in elsewhere. And so that's life-changing for folks. And I like to think that's part of the reason why they did have such bravery, because it really was, it gave them an opportunity at leadership, an opportunity to be part of something in a different way. And so I think when I started learning that, it was like I was getting a new Bible. Like, I'd read this Bible, since, I got my first Bible at 10 years old, and it's, the pages are worn and underlined and highlighted. And I read and read and read the Bible. And then it was like I was introduced to these texts again, not only through feminist perspectives, but through perspectives of looking at Jesus and empire, looking at liberationist theologians' perspectives. And it was like, wow, this got a whole heck of a lot more exciting and a lot more radical. I mean, when you hear, oh, Jesus came to die for your sins, you're a sinner, accept Jesus into your heart, that Jesus is sort of this ethereal, weird avatar type God that um, doesn't really leave you feeling very good. Um, but this new Jesus was really incredible and exciting and like a role model in a different way.
I remember reading the Gospel of Mary for the first time, like Karen
Mm.
King's thing. And there's this
Yeah.
great line in there where, she's like, and Peter's jealous. And I'm like, I bet he was, you know? And
Oh,
they,
yeah.
they effectively destroyed that gospel and hunted down
Yeah.
copies
And
of it.
luckily, I had a chance to take Karen King's course over at HDS and
Mm,
hear directly from her about the Gospels and the the Gospel of Mary, which we have now 3 different versions of the Gospel of Mary, little bits and scraps from here and there, but it just shows the prevalence of how these other Gospels were widespread, and they really were eradicated. So what that tells us is that is in early Christianity, in the first 200 years of Christianity, there were communities that really believed that Mary Magdalene was the rightful heir to the church, that it wasn't Peter, that it was Mary Magdalene. And so this wasn't just a random little sect. If we have 3 of these
right.
ancient texts, and so it just shows you that women really had a powerful role, and it's and that in some ways is what made it not possible for Christianity to be very amenable to patriarchy, to the Roman Empire, to these other structures, these hierarchical structures that, there was a lot of conflict within the early church. Should women be able to speak or not? Should this isn't how things are done, and so a lot of internal Christian problems, and then until we end up, where we are now, just sort of coming out the other side of that, where in the last 100 years, 200 years, women are finally reclaiming their voices. Not, I wouldn't say women are reclaiming their voices. Their voices have always been there and always been pushing back, but that we're making strides in the way that the institutions are set up.
Yeah. It's like they've been custodians, and I don't mean it in the like a janitorial kind of way, although also that, let's not deny that they've done that work too, but like they've sort of been entrusted with something that they've carried through the centuries, um, that I think has been a real compass for the church as well. And I mean, we say the last 100 years, it's really been the last 30, 40 that has. I went to this little mountain holler about 4 years ago, and they were celebrating one of the first Episcopal priests, women priests, and Carter
Mm.
Haywood was there, and so there were
Oh,
4 of
yeah,
them
yeah, yeah.
came, and somehow I got invited. And it was wild because it's like in the middle of the woods, in the middle of North Carolina, and
Oh, wow.
it was so cool to be in the presence of these 4, 4 of the original 11. I'm hoping I'm getting that number right. Um, just like, what is it going to take for us to, like, why is that so scary? It's so interesting to me. I'm not really sure what that is about. I mean, there's a simple answer, which is whatever, power and prestige. But I don't know. So when you're reimagining the church, and I mean, this is your work now, reimagining the church. How how do you take standing in Gethsemane and seeing these women, and now you are a professor and teaching young women and men and trans people, like how are you, how do you sort of bring all of that into it for the reimagining of the church, not in 2 minutes?
Yeah.
I
No
realized the
problem.
magnitude of that question as soon as I was just like, oh shoot. That's unfair.
Well, I mean, I think it's not, I don't think it's unrelated to what we've been talking about. I think the institutions and sort of the oppressive, imperialistic, patriarchal, racist, sexist, transphobic, homophobic institutions that we're living within. Um, it's really in many ways the air we breathe,
Mm-hmm.
especially people of dominant culture. When you're a marginalized person, when you're a person of color in this culture, when you're a queer person, trans person, you start to see these systems of oppression.
Mm-hmm.
And if you're able to, you know, have enough resources to be able to dream a new vision, because not all folks are able to. I mean, they're just severely faced with a lot of oppression and trauma. But those of us that are able to imagine new ways, I think that imagination comes first out of sort of the deep contemplation, the study, the ability to sort of see how these systems are operating, to privilege the voices of folks who know intimately about oppression and marginalized folks. Um, so it's sort of like an inward journey of oneself and to see how your own imagination has been colonized, so to speak. So sort of like a breaking free of your own imagination, knowing we can never be fully free, but knowing that part of our work is the internal work. Um, and then, I mean, it's not linear, obviously. I'm speaking linearly, but then is out of a freed imagination is sort of the dream, like dream space, the ability to imagine. Well, okay, if I can deeply know how things are operating, how can we imagine ways beyond that? And how can we look into our history and see where others have sort of, you know, created visions of the kingdom of God, have practiced it. It's like we're not doing it. We're not doing a new thing. And so where are the voices? Where are the examples from our past, our present, and um, working to implement those. I know we didn't talk about graphic design, but this is where my practice as a designer comes in. Is that designers are like very practical, like really working on defining problems and imagining solutions. And so there's sort of this practical edge of like getting in there, getting our hands dirty, trying new things, trying prototypes, trying this, trying that, not being afraid to get stuck. Just keep moving forward, keep experimenting. Uh, but I don't think you can do that work without a really critical lens and a deep practice of contemplation. Really, it's like the both are needed.
Kate, thanks so much for coming on. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you, Ian. This was great.
I hope you found this conversation with Dr. Kate Common encouraging and helpful for your journey. Thank you for joining us at the Seeker's Table. You can find all of our interviews on YouTube and wherever you listen to podcasts, as well as in the free spiritual resource library on the Seeker's Table website, which is theseekerstable.com. I categorize all of the interviews based on theme and keyword, so if you're looking for guidance in a particular area, you'll be able to find resources that are related to one another. My name is Ian Whitemar, and I hope you'll join me again next week.